Sorry. Okay. Thanks everyone for joining. Everyone from Final Surge. What we're going to be talking about today is nailing marathon nutrition. And, we're really excited about this partnership with Final Surge and opening up the Fuelin program to more and more marathon runners in the bid, not just to ultimately fuel a better performance, but ultimately optimize your health. And I think that's a big factor, which is often missing in individuals who attempt to do marathons. They forget about potentially the health implications and focus too much on the actual race. And we believe that it can be a twofold part to the story. And certainly we believe that we can assist in that. My name's Scott Tindal. I'm Australian. I have worked in and out of professional sports for the past 20 years in a number of different sports, from professional rugby, America's Cup sailing, the NHL, and more recently over the last 5 years in Ironman, and sit on the advisory board as a nutrition expert for Ironman, and have a deep passion for endurance athletes and helping them fuel themselves, not just for performance, but also for their health. And I'll introduce you to Elizabeth.
Hi there, Elizabeth Inpine. I'm always jealous that Scott gets to say he's Australian, so I'm going to say I'm Californian, just because I want something different too. Former endurance athlete, swimmer, and water polo player back in the day. Now, I guess former also triathlete. I've been, working with athletes mostly in the endurance sector. Really female focused nutrition is a passion of mine. Just looking at all the research and kind of taking what we know and seeing in elite and kind of weekend athletes, just what nutrition obstacles we're facing, and really kind of growing that awareness amongst them. And yeah, looking forward to getting to work with you guys.
So what we'll do today, we like to keep these as informal as possible. So if you want to jump in, please post questions in the chat. If you really have a burning question, raise your hand, or just actually jump in, and feel free to interrupt at any time. So we'll go through some marathon mistakes that we see, pre and post session fueling, dialing in your fueling and hydration to set PRs, and then discuss what Fuelin is, and at the very end have enough time for Q&A. But as I said, feel free to jump in at any time. Okay, so the way in which we tried to frame this was probably around fueling, thoughts around fueling, and then looking at sort of the bigger picture, I guess, is the way in which we wanted to frame this. So I think what we're seeing in not just marathon runners, but probably a lot of endurance athletes, is that chronic underfueling is a real problem. I mean, if we look at statistics, around low energy availability, or LEA as it's known, and then REDS, which is the relative energy deficiency in sport, which a lot of female athletes will know because of prior to 2014 was known as the female athletic triad, which related to low energy availability, bone issues, and menstrual dysfunction. That was then changed into what we now know as LEA, low energy availability, and REDS, because it also takes into account male athletes, which unfortunately also suffer from chronic underfueling. And the reason I use chronic is because there is points in time where acute underfueling is obviously required in order to create a caloric deficit, in order to reduce body fat and reduce body weight. However, chronic underfueling, and that can be as little as 3 weeks, can have negative implications on health parameters. So if we look at bone mineral markers, where we look at increased rates of resorption and decreased rates of bone formation, this can occur as little as 3 weeks, and can certainly occur acutely after sessions which aren't fueled appropriately, and certainly aren't fueled appropriately with carbohydrates. So low carbohydrate availability has negative implications on bone formation, and that is very important, not just for female athletes, but also male athletes. If we look at statistics, you know, I talked about that 80% of risk of underfueling, and this comes from multiple different studies where male and female athletes are at risk of that underfueling. And if we give you a sort of, you know, as a broad spectrum, if you're taking in less than 30 calories per kilogram, 30 calories per kilogram, then you are at severe risk of underfueling. You're at moderate risk if you're taking in around 30 to 45 calories per kilogram. And certainly if you're over that 45 calorie per kilogram, then you are reducing the total risk of low energy availability occurring. So they're just some numbers that you may want to consider when you're working out how much fuel you're taking on.
Scott, can you clarify, is that daily calories?
Yeah, that's daily calories. That's daily calories. Now, the distinction with that is that it's well documented in females. It's not quite sure how much the lower end of total calories per kilogram are required for males, and this is ongoing research required. Do you want to say anything else about that, E, in terms of REDs and risk? I mean, stress fractures. So
Yep.
again, sorry, before you jump in, if we look at the most common injuries, and certainly the injuries related more to fueling, bone stress injuries or stress fractures are very common. You'll see prevalence somewhere between 5.7 and 11% of total runners when we look at systematic reviews on running injuries. Now, that may not sound like a lot, but if you develop a stress fracture or a stress reaction, it will keep you out of running for a lot longer than, say, a musculoskeletal injury or like a muscle injury or a strain or anything like that. So that is something to consider, that whilst the prevalence may be lower, the significance of that type of injury is much more severe. And that's something to just consider, okay? And unfortunately, up to 30% in running has been documented as well around these bone stress injuries. So it is very real. It is a very real problem that seems to be getting worse as well amongst runners.
And I think, to Scott's point, the prevalence, runners, especially longer distance runners, will kind of brush off the likelihood of injury or assume that the stress fracture is from overtraining or the muscular exhaustion is from overtraining. It's like, oh, I'm ramping up training for my marathon. This is part of the game. And that's really not the case. We want to make sure that you know that these things, whilst overtraining does play a part in that, underfueling is really what's causing a lot of these problems and all of the symptoms that go around underfueling. So for females specifically, loss of menstrual function, but it's you know, changes in skin, so like drier skin, elevated heart rate at the same pace, trouble with sleep, night sweats, hair loss, and then on all of the more serious ones, the bone loss, long-term hormonal function, impaired reproduction, things like that. So there are other symptoms that runners will look over or dismiss in relation to low energy availability. And these are not normal parts of training for a marathon.
Yeah, and a lot of those can also be related to subjective feelings as well. So low energy, poor mood, they can be tracked, and certainly we track those within the Fuelin app on a daily basis just to flag athletes if things are going in the wrong direction. Other things related to fueling is that for whatever it is, there seems to be this badge of honor amongst marathon runners that you don't need to take on carbohydrates or any fuel during a run, during a race. And if you look at the science and you look at the research, if you want to maximize your performance and go your absolute fastest, then carbohydrates are going to be your primary fuel source and should be utilized in a marathon and also utilized in training to practice what you're going to do in the race situation. And that comes down to the third point there, is what we see with a lot of runners is that they're not practicing what they plan on doing on race day if they are going to use fuel in the race. And that can result in a lot of GI complaints. And what you don't want to be doing is going into a race and trying a new supplement, something that's given out on the day, and trying that and ruining and derailing all that good training that you have done leading into the race. If we move into the middle column, I think this is more around beliefs. So there certainly is some value in fasted training. And certainly if we go back to that chronic underfueling, there will be the intentional use of reducing total fuel. So daily nutrition or daily calories, and also training calories in order to bring about fat loss or weight loss. The problem is you will often see good results early on as a result of doing that, and then get stuck in this downward cycle or this spiral of, oh, I can lose more weight by reducing my fuel even further, but then it has that negative implications, as we discussed, once it becomes a chronic issue. So fasted training or fasted research mainly refers to middle-aged, overweight, pre-diabetic individuals. If you're not one of them and you're trying to go really fast, then you have to ask why you're doing fasted training all the time. As I said, it can be useful, but it's not the be-all, end-all. If you're following a high-fat, low-carb diet, yes, it can be effective in reducing body fat. It can be useful in reducing improving body composition and potentially improving maximal fat oxidation. Yet we know that whether you do a high-fat, low-carb diet or a high-carb, low-fat diet, it comes down to total calories in terms of weight loss. If you're trying to go really fast, we would absolutely steer you away from doing a high-fat diet if your goal is doing a marathon really quickly. The other belief is that often athletes don't want to do or don't believe that heat adaptation preparation is required. And so looking at where your race is going to be, Chicago, is going to be pretty warm, I would imagine. Maybe not this time of year, it should be fairly warm. So are you doing training in the environment of which you expect to be racing? Now that can be through acclimatization, which is actually in the environment, which is a little bit harder for some people if you live in a colder climate, or you can look at acclimation, which is using artificial means, potentially passive or active heat strategies such as hot water immersion, sauna protocols to improve your ability to race really, really quickly. And that's something we cover in Fuelin. And then finally, looking at the big picture, I think so many people who take up running focus too much on the race and maybe not on the bigger picture. So why are you running? Why are you looking to do the marathon? If you take a step back and go, why am I doing this? It's probably more related to health. So have a look at what you're doing from a nutrition standpoint, and is that servicing what your big why is? And if your why is to get healthier, then ask yourself again, are you chronically underfueling? Are you doing, certain beliefs around nutrition, such as high fat, low carb? Are you doing fasted training? And is that servicing what you ultimately want to achieve? For marathon runners, for whatever reason, again, whether it's because you have a fear of being bulky, strength training will reduce your risk of injuries. So it is a very important part of getting a good strength training program into your training week. And then also thinking about the post-season period, where that is where you can maximally improve strength and improve power, which ultimately will help your marathon or your race performance for potentially next season. Yeah, that's probably all I need to say on that. Anything, Elizabeth, you want to add?
Nope, I think you got those covered. That's good.
Cool.
Could we quickly hit on, so Jane had a question. Jane, do you want to just unmute and ask your question?
Sure. Hi, everyone. So I'm a running coach. I would say maybe I have about 4 to 5 athletes, maybe 1/4 of them that have some form of GI issues that we've just been trying to work to. I've just been trying to help them, give them the best options. Okay, let's try this for this long run. Okay, that didn't work. Let's try this. It seems like the best thing has been something like Tailwind, taking liquid nutrition. Sometimes I get concerned that they're not getting enough, like they're not getting to that like 60 grams of carbs per hour or something near that just with taking Tailwind. So I would love to just hear your thoughts and what you recommend.
Yeah, I am going to cover a little bit of carbohydrate capacity, as we term it, a little bit later. Do you want me to go into it now, or do you want me to I can fast forward to it if that's best for you.
No, I just have to leave it like at 5:45. So that was just my biggest question, but I don't want to throw off your whole presentation. So
No. What we'll do is I will look. The short of it is that carbohydrate capacity is an individual athlete's. It's their nuance, isn't it? And so you're doing the right thing by suggesting different products. Certainly, the athlete has to be able to cope with the palatability of that. High concentrated liquid carbohydrates are often the cause of GI issues. So something like Tailwind in particular, I find anecdotally causes the most GI distress in athletes. So I would probably steer them away from Tailwind, to be honest. I would.
Okay, that's super interesting because I feel like I've seen the opposite. So that's yeah.
And a lot of that's anecdotal. If you look at the research on carbohydrate, so if we go to a lot of the studies are done on cyclists. Okay, not many studies are done on runners where they're looking at total volume of carbohydrate and the types of carbohydrates. We know that the oxidation rate, so the way in which the body uses them, is actually fairly similar across liquids, chews, and gels. So that's one factor. So then it comes down to GI complaints. With runners, liquid carbs tend to cause more GI complaints than gels and blocks. Bars certainly are a different scenario. And if you're running a marathon, I wouldn't recommend using bars if you're trying to go really quickly. I think the type of gel or blocks that is being made, being used, and the type of carbohydrates is a really important point. If they're taking in lower amounts of carbohydrates, i.e. somewhere around 60 to 70 grams might sound like a lot, but you could potentially just use a glucose only gel at that point, and that will probably be tolerated better than something that has glucose and fructose in it. So the ingredients of that product are going to be very significant. We know that fructose, whilst it is a multiple transportable type of carb, so it's a different type of carbohydrate and uses a different transporter from the small intestine to be absorbed by the body, is really important when we're getting into the sort of 80, 90, 120 grams of carbs per hour. But if they're not at that level, then you probably don't want to be using fructose, because fructose will slow down the rate of gastric emptying. So that is an important point. The other point is that we know that through consistent, repeated carbohydrate or higher carbohydrate fueling, that is going to improve the numbers of these GLUT transporters in the small intestine. So in terms of from a physiological standpoint, you can improve the ability to transport the carbohydrates and have them absorbed by the body through repetitive practice. And that comes back to that point of practicing race nutrition and practicing higher carbohydrate fueling in the sessions that are appropriate, i.e. Z3 or race pacer and above. Definitely, I mean, what we recommend is at least 10 times and starting to understand what your carbohydrate capacity is in order to improve that. And some people, depending on power output and pace, they may not require that super high carbohydrate content, and maybe something like 30 to 50 grams is actually fine for them to race with. So they may be trying to do too much. They may have ingredients that are causing issues, or it may be the actual product.
Scott, do you want to give a couple examples of ones that we like, gels and chews that we tend to recommend for our athletes?
Yeah. So Endurance Tap is very good. If there's any Canadians out there, it's very good. It's maple syrup. It's closer to this. It's 1-to-1 in terms of glucose, fructose. It's a naturally occurring product, obviously, that does have these two types of multiple transportable carbs. The viscosity is fantastic. It just goes down like a dream, and it tastes fantastic. Precision hydration, yes, it is a 2-to-1 ratio. It is glucose, fructose. It could be something to use. The palatability of that's good. Morton is a hydrogel. Again, the science on that is whether you think hydrogels are the key to maximizing performance, I think is still up for debate, but the palatability of Morton gels is pretty good. What's another? Never Second is a pretty good gel, but again, that's a 2-to-1. And then the SIS gels, whilst being a bit bigger, have gone closer to this 1 to 0.8 glucose fructose. Coda and Base Performance, I believe, are glucose only gels, and that could be something to look at as well.
Can you share, what was the first one you said? The Canadian one?
Endurance Tap.
Yeah, I'll type it in here in the chat.
You can get that through the feed as well. I believe they sell it through there as well. So, and you could get athletes to purchase single products through the feed. We're actually speaking to the feed at the moment, hopefully going to bring them on board so we can get athletes through the app to choose these individual products and try them, because that's what it comes down to a lot.
And Scott, could you just speak to reducing fiber intake from a GI perspective?
Yep. So another thing that should be considered by athletes is there's probably a couple of things. So reducing total fiber intake in the days leading into these very high intensity sessions. We know that fiber is very important from a health perspective, but in terms of increasing fecal matter inside you, especially in the large intestine, which could result in GI issues from a lower GI issues such as diarrhea or flatulence or cramping, then reducing fiber on the days leading up can be a really good strategy to reduce GI complaints. Using higher fiber intake on the morning of, though, is something to consider as well, because that actually becomes heat protective to the gut lining as duration extends beyond 3 hours. So carbohydrates, then protein and fat has absolutely no impact on heat stress injury to the gut lining. So that is another reason why you would reduce fat intake and certainly not be on a high fat diet if you're looking to go really, really fast in a marathon.
And in this case, when you're talking about fiber and carbs, we're not talking about like broccoli and asparagus for breakfast on race day. We're talking like oats. Yeah,
oatmeal, oatmeal, whole wheat toast, something like that, depending on dietary intolerances or allergies would obviously be factored in.
So to summarize, reducing fiber like up to the morning of, but then maybe having something high fiber like oatmeal.
Yeah.
That morning. That's okay.
Yeah. So we and again, practicing that, the way that we would structure it is that we would advise, set in the meals leading up to reduce fiber, push certain meals to choose and reduce fiber intake, and then practicing something like an overnight oats, practicing your race day breakfast on the morning of sessions that are replicating race duration or intensity, and then certainly being comfortable with that meal or that race day breakfast so that on race day, it becomes second nature.
So one of my marathon runners that's actually doing Chicago, she's been building, and we've been practicing her race day breakfast, starting with her like 12-mile, then her 16, like that long weekend one, her 16, her 18, she just did her 20. So it's not just once seeing how it works, it's repetitively practicing on those longer weekly sessions leading up to, and then that way you can make changes and adjustments as you go.
So I think that's a really nice segue into this slide, which is ultimately a lot of athletes don't know what to do, and there's a lot of considerations. And so if we then go through all the decision making that has to be applied when thinking about your training program and how to apply nutrition, there are a few key questions that you should be asking yourself, like, what is your current goal? Is it performance or is it body comp fat loss? Because that's going to dictate the amount of fuel that on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis is going to be provided to you or what you need to take in. Now, if you are in a body comp fat loss part of the program, and as you're tailoring into probably the back end and getting closer to races, you're probably not thinking, or we shouldn't be thinking too much about that, and just accepting where you are is where you are. Because if you go down that body comp fat loss type goal too close to your race, then you have to accept that some of those sessions aren't going to be as good as if you were fueling for performance and accepting where your current body weight is. So that's something to consider. You then want to look at the session details. What type of session is it? Is it a long, slow, Z1, Z2 session, just getting time under the belt? Or is it sort of Z3 and race pace? That's going to then dictate, type of fueling that you're going to consume before, during, and after, the total duration and the intensity, as I touched on. And then finally selecting the appropriate fuel for that based on pre-session, in-session, and post-session, the types and amount that we just touched on. And these are all the decisions that athletes have to make, and it's very understandable why there is so much confusion, and it is so easy to go into that chronic underfueling if you're not careful and if you're not thinking about these types of decisions. So something to consider, and just the way in which we map it out, we look at a traffic light system. So red being lower amounts of carbohydrates, around 30 grams of carbs, yellow being around 50 grams of carbs, and green light is sort of your go-to. You see a green light, you know you can sort of go pretty nuts on the carbs. So very simply, and this is breaking it down in a very simplistic manner, but anything less than 60 minutes, look, you can probably do that session in terms of pre-session fueling fasted. And I know I did talk about fasting before, or if you're not comfortable with fasting or it doesn't fit your overall caloric intake, then something like as simple as a piece of toast with some almond butter jelly or peanut butter jelly would be a very good choice, or something as simple as a banana, which would give you glucose and fructose in a very natural form. So something as simple as that can be done. If the session duration is somewhere between an hour and 2.5 hours, and at Z1, Z2, then certainly you'd want to be thinking of taking on some carbohydrates. Now, this is in relation to carbohydrates in particular, but certainly taking on some carbs, a little bit of fat, and potentially taking on some protein as well. Now, you may not choose spicy Moroccan eggs. That may not be the choice for you. You may just go, you know what, for a lower amount of carbohydrates, for something like that, it could be as simple as a piece of toast with, as I described, the nut butter and jelly, so giving you a little bit of fat, a little bit of carbs, and a little bit of protein in order to get you going. Now, this is all related to pre-session fueling. If that session is of higher intensity and it's for that duration, you're thinking, okay, I probably need to take on a little bit more carbs before I go out. And certainly if you're extending beyond 2.5 hours, and whether it's a Z1, Z2 or a Z3, 5, don't be afraid of consuming carbohydrates before, because we know that as duration extends, that's probably going to be one of the biggest defining factors around physiological changes in terms of improvement of mitochondrial function, improvements of maximal fat oxidation, improvements in performance, regardless of what type of fueling you're taking on before. Carbohydrates or high fat, it's not really going to make a difference.
And Scott, when we're talking about pre-session nutrition, I always get a lot of questions. Is that 10 minutes before, 30 minutes before, 45 minutes before? When's that? Let's remind them of kind of that optimal window.
Yeah.
Of that.
So to Jane's question about GI issues, there's a number of different ways you can train the gut. And one of those can be eating immediately before a session to actually improve perception from a brain perspective, and that feeling of fullness. So that is something to consider if you want to try and train the gut, either taking in large amounts of liquid or a higher volume food prior to doing a session. That is an effective strategy if you do that repeatedly to improve GI complaints, especially upper GI complaints where they have that feeling of fullness. Other than that, we would recommend probably a minimum of 60 minutes before, certainly somewhere around 90 to 120 minutes before, especially if the volume of food is going to be a little bit more. You should be aware of a phenomenon called rebound hypoglycemia, which will usually occur if you eat somewhere around 30 to 40 minutes before a session. If you do consume a degree of carbohydrates 30 to 40 minutes before a session, you'll often have a lag in energy where you'll see blood glucose drop. If you're not going to take in other fuel on top of that, then you'll often feel pretty terrible during the session. It affects about 10 to 15% of athletes. So you could be one of those athletes that does get affected with that. So it's something to consider as well. Then we go into post-session. And I think this is the other really important point for a lot of endurance athletes, is this is where, not just from a carbohydrate perspective, but certainly from a protein perspective, you want to be making sure you're getting the most out of your food in order to recover the most. Typically, we see in endurance athletes a very low protein consumption. probably because of fear of increased muscle bulk or increased weight. That's not going to be the case. And if anything, you want to be taking on fairly high amounts of protein as an endurance athlete in order to maximize recovery from a muscle standpoint, but also a bone standpoint. Also improving, what's the word I'm searching for? In terms of, reducing risk of illness from upper respiratory tract infections. Protein can be positive in terms of reducing that risk as well. So that is something to consider. A lot of people talk about cortisol levels. Cortisol is a natural hormone that is released and is very good for you. Chronically high cortisol levels obviously is something that we don't want to have, but consuming carbohydrates is a very effective strategy to reducing acute cortisol levels. So that is something to consider as well. The way in which we think about this, if you're in a performance goal and you're looking to maximize performance, maybe because you've got a second session that day or your training block is actually fairly high intensity with high load, then you're going to be increasing the amounts of carbohydrates after slightly shorter sessions. And that's an important point to consider. If you're in a body comp sort of goal, then, you know, a session of 60 to 90 minutes, you could fuel yourself again periodically, and this is only for one meal post session, but you could have a lower amounts of carbs as long as the pulses of carbohydrates and protein throughout the day are on point with what your total calorie intake is required. And as I've put there at the end, any sessions over 150 minutes, really the total amount of carbohydrates is going to be dependent on the athlete body size and their total calorie intake for that day and across the week. So all those decisions there are very difficult to make, and hopefully what what you're seeing is there is a lot of decision making there. And so our goal is really about maximizing your performance potential, and that performance potential is not just performance in the sake of your race, but also maximizing your health potential, which ultimately, if you're a healthy athlete, you're going to be a high performing athlete. So to Jane's question before about carbohydrate capacity. So this is what we talk about, allocating at least 10 or so gut training sessions. If you suffer from GI complaints during running, then you want to be doing this. Again, a lot of the researchers looked at consecutive gut training sessions, so 10 plus in a row. Now, for the average athlete out there, you probably don't have the ability to do 10 in a row because of real life and work, and that your coach hasn't planned in 10 consecutive gut training sessions. So that could take as many as 10 weeks if you're only doing one of these sessions per week. So that's something to consider as well, using what you plan on using in a race in training. And that could start as much as 10 to 12 weeks out. So 3 months before your race, you're starting to think of what products am I using? What products can I tolerate? And how much can I tolerate? So the way we do it in the app is athletes would record the duration of the session, the distance, and then the products that you're consuming during that. And what that will do is provide you with a number based around your average total intake across all your sessions, what your peak total amount would be for a particular session, breaking that down into grams per hour and then grams per hour per kilogram. So you can get an inkling for that. For females, you should be hitting a minimum of 0.8 grams per kilo of body weight as a first tier. For males, you want to be aiming for at least 1 gram per kilo of body weight. So if we're thinking from a male perspective, if you're a 70 kilo athlete, our view is that you should be able to take on around 70 grams per hour. For a female, that's probably, if they're a 70 kilo female, they're probably going, which is what, 150 pounds, you probably should be able to take on at least 60 grams per hour in that case. We also split it out so that you can see what you're taking in. Is it predominantly solids? Is it predominantly fluids? And then are you recording GI complaints with that? And so you can start to be, a bit of a scientist within yourself and start to work out what products you can tolerate and at what rate, and still feel very good about your race performance. And then, again, this is just another sort of screenshot so that you can get an inkling of what we do. So on the right-hand side is, that's an hour race, an hour's run. That person has taken on 50 grams of carbs, so probably 2 gels in that, which worked out at around just under 50 grams an hour, and they didn't get any discomfort. They took on, in this case, 2 Morton gels. And that would sort of play into what we're seeing in that right-hand side. So at the moment, it's maybe not as good as what they could be, but certainly heading in the right direction. The other point there is also, if you look at the top, the left-hand screen, you'll see at the very top that there's less than 85 Fahrenheit or less than 30 degrees Celsius. So that is in a cooler environment. The athletes have the ability to record if it was a higher temperature, and then look at those 2 differing types of results or that data based on what the environment is that they're training in. And ultimately, if you're going to be racing in more than 85 Fahrenheit, you want to have enough data points in that subsection at that temperature in order to know that you can tolerate that amount of carbohydrates in that type of race conditions. And so I think the big thing here is it's not, yes, initially we're using the best scientific research and recommendations to provide you with a very detailed, individualized plan. But as the user, or as you as the runner starts to use the program, the results that you're actually putting into the program will actually result in your fueling plan being developed. So it is very customized and very individualized to you, not just theoretical sort of recommendations.
Yeah, and just to quickly chime in, even if you're not using the app, like, we do highly recommend that you track this. So Scott used to do all of this for his athletes on a spreadsheet. But the key point here is measuring what you're doing so you understand, and then being able to, as Scott mentioned in the previous screen there, like adapting, right, to where you are currently. Are you getting GI distress? What's the next experiment you're going to test?
Yeah. And then really in terms of how we work, so you would, we integrate with Final Surge. So all your sessions delivered by your coach are updated. We sync with that. And so your program would be delivered through the Fuelin app. So you can see on this screenshot, which is one of the athletes, she's actually a triathlete, but she's doing a lot of running as well in preparation for a marathon. She has a yellow breakfast and is being told to minimize vegetable intake for this meal because it is a Z3 session. That's the amount of fuel being recommended to her. She knows what fuel that she uses in order to hit that 70 to 120 to 100 grams per hour. She doesn't use any fat in her fueling. As you can see, it's a plus or minus of fat. And that's just based around total calories. She tends to use just carbohydrates to fuel that. She's actually a 56-year-old female age group athlete and can tolerate 100 grams an hour very, very comfortably now. She used to get a lot of GI issues, but through repetitive training of this, she's managed to improve that significantly. So you would sync in with Final Surge, or we would sync in with Final Surge. You would get a program that is laid out every meal before. If there's in-session fueling recommended, and then post-session fueling, that's recommended. That's provided to you on a daily basis and over a week, and obviously over the months. You have the ability to track food within, so you can either track within the app with hundreds of different meals within. It also syncs into MyFitnessPal and to Lose It, so that the macro target, which is that row at the very top, would be automatically deducted from those targets as you go. You can track sweat rate. So we're big believers in tracking sweat rate over multiple sessions as well. So you get an understanding of what your range of fluid requirements is going to be. And this becomes very important when duration of a session extends beyond 3 hours as well. And you can measure and track that progress through the app. And then finally, probably one of the greatest things about Fuelin is weekly Q&A sessions like today, where topics of interest are submitted by athletes or things that we're finding interesting in the endurance market. we would hold a 60-minute Q&A session once weekly. So effectively, we do all the heavy lifting for you. And I think what what this slide is really getting at is that ultimately there is a lot of calculations and a lot of detail that has to be made by the athlete. And so hopefully what we're doing is taking the pain of that decision paralysis away, and providing it to you in a very simple manner whereby you can just look at the color of the meal and go, okay, I don't need a lot of carbohydrates today, or actually I do need to take in a lot of carbohydrates for the need to A, improve my health, and B, improve my performance. And this is just some further screenshots of what might be presented to you. So again, just looking at Julia's program. So she may, with that breakfast, she's been recommended a moderate carb meal. Now she is going out to do a Z3 session. It would be of significant duration. So it's going to be in that it's going to be up to at least 150 minutes. She would tap on that yellow cell. She would have favorites saved throughout it, but something as simple as white toast with almond butter jelly could be what she chooses to go and fuel that session appropriately. As we touched on, the amount of carbohydrates and fuel that she's requiring. And then if you can see at the bottom, there's hydration recommendations. So in this case, through repetitive weighing of herself before and after sessions and recording what she's consumed, we know that in less than 85 Fahrenheit, she only requires around a half a liter to a little bit more than half a liter per hour of water and electrolytes to keep her body weight loss at under 2.5%. As the temperature gets a little bit hotter, she requires a little bit more. So depending on what that session is, she can then adjust her fluid intake accordingly based on what she requires. Post-session, she's recommended a snack. In this case, she may choose something as simple as chopped banana oats to give her some protein, some fat, and some carbohydrates post-fueling. It doesn't have to be a gourmet meal. The most important thing from our perspective is it's practical and easy for the athlete to get in. And then as you can see, lunch is again a higher carb meal. And in this case, she was choosing chicken with sweet potato. And they're all in-app recommendations. Any questions? So I know there's probably a lot, and everyone's like, "Ooh, that's a lot to take in." And I guess that's the point of this. It's not easy. There's new research coming out all the time. We try and stay on top of that as best we can. The recommendations that we provide are based on the latest scientific research, but also on our personal experience and expertise of working with hundreds of different endurance athletes along our careers.
So I'll start it off, Scott. I know one that we get a lot of the time is carbohydrate loading. They're marathoners. They're probably wondering, should they, shouldn't they? How does that work? Such as bowls of pasta the week leading up.
Yeah, I think if you look through the research, and certainly if someone wants to read some articles on this, so I wrote an article on carbohydrate loading for Triathlete magazine recently. There's certainly benefits in carbohydrate loading. There's many different ways of doing it, and it certainly has progressed over time. You don't need to do 5 days of carbohydrate loading. Certainly 24 hours in advance has been shown to be beneficial. I'd probably start at somewhere around 36 to 48 hours before. You don't want to be doing it based on percentage of total calorie intake. So traditionally it was done around 50% of your total calorie intake for the day. The issue with that is if you're eating a low calorie day, then 50% might not be enough grams per kilogram to actually increase or super compensate the liver and muscle glycogen stores. So for athletes out there, if you are going to be doing carbohydrate loading, you certainly want to be aiming as a female a minimum of 8 grams per kilo body weight of carbohydrates in those days leading up. For males, it's a little bit, it's not quite equivocal in terms of the amounts required, but certainly I would be aiming for around 8 to 10 grams per kilo body weight as well. And in that carbohydrate loading, you're starting to choose higher glycemic index and higher glycemic load foods with reduced fiber content, as discussed before, for the number of reasons why you would want to reduce fiber intake in those days leading up. The other consideration with the carbohydrate load might be reducing FODMAPs. So FODMAPs are fermentable oligosaccharides, disaccharides, and polyols. Simple language, they're types of carbohydrates that ferment in the gut and can cause GI complaints. So fructose is one of those in particular that may, depending on the individual athlete, may want to be reduced in those days leading up, because they could cause some GI complaints that runners complain of.
I see that Anthony has a question. Anthony, do you want to unmute and ask your question? If not, it says, could you also touch on carb deprivation before?
Yes. So the old way of carb loading was to really do glycogen depletion and really go sort of hard in terms of reducing carbohydrate intake to very low amounts in order to supercompensate the liver and muscle glycogen. Again, probably not required, and you have to factor in that those sessions are typically very, very hard, and you don't necessarily want to be doing that on the race week because it may make you psychologically feel very drained. There certainly is some evidence to suggest that maybe 48 hours before, doing some higher intensity interval sessions to deplete glycogen could be beneficial, but I think you have to weigh up whether that psychological element of doing a really hard session before a race, is it worthwhile, and is it going to make the difference? I'd probably argue that you want to be pretty relaxed going into a marathon and probably not put yourself through that stress, and you could still super compensate muscle glycogen and liver glycogen just by eating more of those carbohydrate sources. Does that answer your question, Anthony? I know you don't have your voice at the moment, but yeah, just put a thumbs up or a thumbs down in the chat if that is the case.
Scott, what about the 30-minute post-run window for refueling or post?
Yeah. So a lot of the research around that, you need to smack down a protein shake and carbohydrates and that in the first 30 minutes. Otherwise, muscles are going to drop off and all your performance gains and adaptation are going to be lost, is not correct. So you probably typically have actually around 2 hours to consume your food. Now, the closer to the end of that session that you do consume some fuel, i.e. in particular protein and carbohydrates, is going to be beneficial to you. But just know that if you don't get in like a meal within 30 seconds of finishing the run, you're not going to suffer incredibly. So try and get it in within 60 minutes, certainly, but you do have up to 2 hours to get that in. The rates of glycogen replenishment will drop off as the time exceeds, and things like muscle protein synthesis and muscle building would drop off gradually as the time extends beyond the end of that session. But certainly you're not going to fade away into a withering heap if you don't get it in the first 30 seconds. On that though, you do want to consider taking in mixed macronutrients. So certainly carbohydrates and protein again will improve glycogen resynthesis more so than anything else. So that is a good reason to include protein with a carbohydrate source post-training to maximize recovery. Any other questions? Feel free to ask anything. Nothing is silly, and often every athlete is thinking the same thing. So feel free to speak up.
we didn't spend a lot of time on hydration. So is it okay to just grab water from the aid stations?
Yeah, look, I think we've got a very interesting Q&A tomorrow, which everyone is welcome to join. It's actually an open source Q&A with Dr. Alan McCubbin from Monash University, and we're talking about hydration and electrolytes in particular, and sodium tomorrow. There is a very big push for sodium consumption amongst endurance athletes, and hopefully tomorrow what we do is dispel some of the myths around that. I think grabbing water from the aid stations is absolutely fine. I think over consuming fluids is probably a bigger risk than under consuming. Everyone will have that fear of, well, it's drilled into you that you could become dehydrated and therefore that could have massive impact on your race. But over consuming fluids in the form of what develops as hyponatremia is far more dangerous. So understanding your sweat rate, or at least understanding what your range of sweat rate would be through repeated testing, i.e. weighing yourself before and after sessions, is very important, so that you go into that race knowing, okay, I need to roughly consume this amount of fluid in order to reduce my body weight percentage loss exceeding sort of 3 or 4%. You will hear numbers being thrown around you want to avoid becoming more than 2% dehydrated in order to maximize performance. It is correct from a clinical, from a research perspective, but you will see many, many athletes at the end of a race being far more than 2% dehydrated and performing very well and hitting a PR. So don't be afraid of not drinking, but also don't be afraid of drinking, if that makes sense. So the more of an understanding you have of what your sweat rate is and your requirements, then you'll be in a better position to know how much water you should be consuming at aid stations and whether or not you need to be taking in extra sodium in relationship to that as well.
Great, thanks. All right, there's 2 more great questions. I'm going to start with Michael's because I think it's pretty simple. How much water should be consumed with each 25-gram 100 carb gel?
Yeah, I think Michael, it comes down to what I was just saying, is that carbohydrates are probably the key element in terms of improving sodium absorption and also water absorption. So depending on what your sweat rate is, depending on the environment, and depending on how much heat you're producing. So your sweat rate is going to be dictated by how much heat you produce internally. And that heat production internally is based on effectively how much power you're producing. So if you're going very, very fast, your sweat rate will ultimately be higher than someone who's going very, very slow. I've started doing a few reels on Instagram related to this, like in relationship to power output, body fat percentage and its influence on sweat rate. But the short answer to how much water to get that gel down is probably just how much water you need to actually swallow the gel. In the case of actually getting the gel down, the total amount of water you need to consume is going to be based on what your sweat rate is. And Michael, feel free to just unmute and just ask, if that answers your question or not.
The Morton gels, are you supposed to take them with water? This is a question from Anthony. Can you take them alone since they're the hydrogels?
Yeah, you can take it alone. I mean, it's just whether you can swallow. I mean, I tend to use a precision gel. I just swallow it on the go. I take a sip of water afterwards just to flush it down. So it's really a personal preference, I think, in that case.
And then Marissa had what do you suggest for training in high humidity?
Training in high humidity?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so your sweat rate or your rate of evaporation is going to reduce. So your temperature is probably going to increase. So I think ultimately doing some heat adaptation work would make sense. So whether you can do that in terms of acclimatization and practice in that environment, or using a passive acclimation strategy such as hot water immersion or a sauna protocol, would certainly help your ability to cope with high humidity and high external temperatures. And we have a hot water immersion protocol that we use with athletes, and they generally start that a minimum of 6 days prior. And that's just using a bathtub. You immerse yourself up to your neck in 40 degrees Celsius water. I think that's 110 Fahrenheit. You do that for a minimum of 30 minutes up to 40 minutes. You do it on consecutive days. If you did it for 6 consecutive days, that would give you roughly 12 days benefits after ceasing that hot water immersion protocol. And then from a vascular standpoint, it has many benefits in terms of cardiac output, stroke volume, whatnot, but also improving earlier sweat rate and higher sweat rates in environments which would require it. So it's certainly beneficial in that case.
Good stuff.
Anything else? Yeah, and you certainly jump on our YouTube channel, have a look at videos. We've done a lot of Q&As relating to that. As I said, tomorrow's Q&A, I think if you sign up for our newsletter via our website, we can then send you the link to the Q&A session with Dr. Alan McCubbin tomorrow, which could be very interesting for a lot of you to hear. And obviously you can reach out to us to send us an email at info@fuelin.com and have a look on our website as well.
And social media.
There's many articles. What's that? And social, yeah, obviously.
And Instagram, it's at Get Fuelin.
Yeah, at Get Fuelin is we try and do as many informative sort of reels and videos and posts and things like that as possible to try and keep you as updated as possible.
Perfect. Well, just a final reminder is we have a quick 2-question survey when you close out of the Zoom session. If you can please take a quick minute to answer. We love your feedback on how we can continue to make this better.
Yeah, that'd be really great. And yeah, hopefully it's been informative and educational, and hopefully giving you an insight into the way in which we try and program personalized performance nutrition through Fuelin, and you know, really try and maximize ultimately your health. I think that's got to be the key parameter here is whilst racing and performing at your absolute best is obviously a top goal. I think being extremely healthy should also sit somewhere in there as well. Cool. Well, thank you, everyone. If there's no further questions, we'll end the session there.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.